And welcome to your Week 6 lecture, where we're going to be discussing frameworks and conceptual considerations. So our learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you'll be able to evaluate how the prison experience shapes a person's identity post-incarceration. You'll be able to compare the narrative identity theory and the theory of cognitive transformation, both in the context of desistance from criminal offending, as well as illustrate how increases in agency, communion, and spiritual resources, as well as generative activities, can support desistance from crime. So what we know is that who someone is before they enter prison is typically not the same person that's going to be entering back into society. So we're going to dive into how the prison experience shapes the person's identity. And we will look at factors that can improve chances of having a successful reentry, as well as sort of the conditions or situations that can actually hinder their success. So what's really important is that we understand the two major theories that can explain these phenomenons, namely narrative identity theory and the theory of cognitive transformation, both specifically looking at those in the context of desistance from offending. So the first article that we're going to look at is the Beyond Recidivism, Prison Experiences and Identity in Women's Life Stories, Implications for Reentry. And this goes over those two theories that I was just discussing. So when we look at narrative identity theory, there are three main factors or agencies here. We have agency, ultimate concerns, and communion involved in here. So what we know is that women may feel the pains of incarceration more acutely than men do because they're trying to parent children from the inside, and they also tend to have less contact with the outside world than men would. So this theory assumes that an individual constructs their life stories to reflect how they currently see themselves, namely with themes of agency, ultimate concerns, and communion. So when we talk about agency, we're talking about the personal concern for power, mastery, and having independence. When we look at communion, this is having affiliation and nurturance, so being connected to others. And then ultimate concerns is where you have that religious or spiritual growth or well-being. And that all of these themes sort of converge to make the narrative identity theory. So we know that there are certain themes that support desistance from crime, which is having a negative experience like incarceration, which can actually stimulate positive identity development because they now see themselves as taking on pro-social roles or contributing to future generations. And a lot of these people have stories, when they have stories that include a redemptive imagery that report well-being and generativity, both of these support a desistance from illegal behaviors. On the other hand, you can have contamination sequences, which are simply having negative experiences and taking those negative experiences that just build on one another, namely maybe being through incarceration. And those are all associated with depression, low life satisfaction, and the absence of generativity. And generativity, we know, is just basically engaging in activities that are giving back to others or activities that are going to be meaningful to you and to someone else. When we look at the theory of cognitive transformation, we have here pro-social roles being linked to agenic moves, and then that leads into what we consider hooks for change. And all of that then leads to desistance from crime. So these links, what this does is it links changes in identity to perceptions of available pro-social roles and agenic moves to grab onto those hooks for change that are then going to enable people to fulfill new roles. And hooks can include things like marriage, children, or religion. And desistance then typically occurs when that person is viewing themselves in a new way and they've taken on those new roles, which are now incompatible with their prior or previous law-breaking behavior. Now, what impact does imprisonment have on one's identity? Well, the argument can be made that even when we have programs in prison that are designed to help people while they're incarcerated, the greater environment of incarceration has impacts that even the best programs can't help people overcome. So being the loss of liberty, loss of personal identity, being separated from their family and their friends, having loss of goods or services that they can't receive while they're in prison that they would be able to receive in the community. So what this study did was it used the life story interview protocol, which first guides participants through identification of various chapters in their life, and then asks for detailed descriptions of the high point, low point, negative childhood memory, positive childhood memory, experience with ultimate or broader force, a turning point, and then a vivid adult memory or a wisdom event. So in this study, pains of incarceration were some of the themes that came out, reported actually by 32 of the 44 participants that they had. When you're talking about these pains of incarceration, they're referring to distress in dealing with the situations and people that are actually outside of prison while they're on the inside. Being separated from their children, having poor living conditions while they were in prison, reported abuse and control from prison staff. One inmate, I believe, reported that she didn't eat all of her food, so she was forced to stand in handcuffs for a long length of time. And then just having a lack of medical and mental health services, but then also an overuse of medications while they were incarcerated. Sort of this prison fatigue where simply just being incarcerated just makes you tired. There's not a whole lot to do sometimes while you're incarcerated if there's not programs to engage in. And then having that limited freedom. So at the same time, you did have some individuals reporting that prison was a deterrent for them, that because they were incarcerated, they knew that their future self when they got out, that's not someone who they saw themselves being, and they never wanted to be incarcerated again. We also have either redemptive or these contamination sequences. So these were reported in 21 out of the 44 participants. And this is simply when they described being a deepening or developing a relationship to God. They also were able to build on their own negative experiences to be able to help others and help others to not make the same choices. And they were also there to comfort others. They could use things as their developing relationship with God. So they would maybe read Bible verses to other inmates while they were incarcerated if they were going through tough times. Or they had these contamination sequences while they were in prison. So examples of this included continued rule violations or fighting, which either earned them more time or for one woman even led to a miscarriage for her. So these women said that prison really made them worse and exacerbated their mental health issues and made them go crazy. So there's a sort of like the yin and yang, the redemption and the contamination, where certain individuals take prison and form those redemptive narratives, and others take that and form contamination sequences where they just keep getting worse and worse and get themselves sort of in this downward spiral of just nothing's going to improve, this is terrible, it's only going to get worse. You then have the cognitive transformation process. So this was reported in 21 out of the 44 participants, where they described the pro-social roles that they wanted to fulfill, namely being involved more as mothers or grandmothers. They also explained that the prison experience contributed to the assessment of past antisocial behaviors, which were now no longer consistent with who they wanted to be or their new pro-social identities. They also earned certificates, held jobs while they were incarcerated, maybe wrote a book or figured out how to do crafts, attended GED programs. These individuals had this cognitive transformation because they were an active participant in their own lives, an active participant in their prison experience, and they didn't let prison make them. They made who they were through prison. These individuals then also expressed a dissatisfaction and just a rejection of the criminal lifestyle. For 14 of the 44 participants, they had changed identities. So they noted that prison changed their identity and they were a totally different person after the experience. A lot of these individuals were really just proud to show that they were actually strong enough to change their lifestyle, to no longer be someone who engaged in criminal offending. Now, our next article we're going to look at is Beyond Recidivism. Does thinking of oneself as a typical former prisoner contribute to reentry success or failure? So what we discuss in this article is how one's identity sort of is formed by their membership to various social groups which is based on 3 components. You have the cognitive, evaluative, and the emotional. Cognitive is where the individual is aware that they're actually part of this group. Evaluative then is looking at what is the status of this group within society. So if you're someone who is, we're going to say the group is ex-offenders or formerly incarcerated, you know you're part of that group. Now, are you going to evaluate yourself? Let's see where the status of that group falls within society. And then emotional, what is your attachment, or what is the attachment that individual feels towards that group? So how emotionally invested are they? And when we're talking about trying to create redemptive narratives and trying to create new positive identities, the person doesn't want to, have that cognitive, evaluative, and emotional connection to that group anymore. They're now looking to form new identities through new groups, ones that are going to be pro-social, ones that are not going to encourage the same behaviors as before. This article also discusses identity theory desistance, which places human agency front and center of the theory by asserting that desistance is actually brought about by the decisions and actions of the offender. So persistent offenders tend to see themselves as lacking agency within their lives, and that it simply is determined for them, that they have no control over their life, which is a little bit what I talked about before, of forming those narratives while they're in prison. And people need to remove themselves from that sort of feared self or the negative self-view so that they're able then to develop a good self-identity or a positive self-identity. And research shows us that those who have a positive mindset actually have better post-prison outcomes because it promotes beneficial coping skills and psychological well-being. These individuals tend to have higher motivation, greater persistence, more effective performance, and greater success overall post-prison. And those with generative activities or those sort of giving back, where they're giving back to society, tend to also fare better than those who don't engage in those types of activities. It's also important to know, though, this article mentions that incarceration itself may actually have lost some of its stigmatizing effect when we're talking about inner cities or populations where individuals being incarcerated is very prevalent. Because of the large number of individuals that are sharing that experience, it tends to have a much less negative impact than it does on communities or individuals who live in areas where it's not a common theme. So the current study found that the typical former prisoner, so what they did was they had individuals report on their perception of stigma, social identity as a former prisoner, coping strategies, psychological well-being, demographics, and criminal history. So 53% disagreed at some level that they were a typical former prisoner. But those who strongly agreed with being a typical former prisoner showed higher perception of personally being stigmatized by the system. They perceived the criminal justice system as legitimate, which is interesting. They have less formal education. They typically had a lower self-esteem, and they perceive a strong likelihood of having a rearrest within the next 3 years. So that strong agreement with being a typical former prisoner really had negative consequences for individuals. But then when you look at those who had more formal education specifically, they reported a less agreement that they were a typical former prisoner, and they had improved employment and recidivism outcomes. So there's a few conclusions you can draw looking at that education does play a huge part in one, how you look at yourself or how one would look at themselves as a typical former prisoner, and then having better outcomes post-prison. And some of the interventions that they discuss, that would be very helpful for these individuals or those who have that sort of typical former prisoner attitude, are ones that are going to enhance hope and optimism as well as agency within their own lives. So a few of the programs they talk about are motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapies. So motivational interviewing is actually huge, particularly in the probation field of the adult system. We use it in our department, juvenile probation uses it, and motivational interviewing is really just a way to enhance the intrinsic motivations that an individual already has, moving them towards positive change. So it's really trying to get people to see that discrepancy between the life that they want, the person that they want to be, and their actions and decisions that are keeping them on the other side of that line, namely being someone who engages in crime, who doesn't desist from criminal offending. And then cognitive behavioral therapy is somewhat similar, but a little bit more directive, where motivational interviewing is a conversational style, where cognitive behavioral therapies can be either conversation, they can be worksheets, they can be role plays. There's a lot of different ways to do that, where the two big components are cognitive and behavioral. Cognitive, you're working on the way the person thinks, and behavioral, you're working through discussing their behaviors and then actually having them implement new strategies to change those behaviors. And we're going to follow this up with our last reading for the week, which was Homeward Chapter 9, which specifically looked at women. So when we're talking about all of these different ways that an individual can change their personal identities, that they can change how they view themselves, and then how the world actually views them post-incarceration, that all applies to both men and women. But when we talk about women specifically, they have much different pathways, both in and out of the system. So women have distinctively different pathways than men do. When we look at females before prison, 29% of women reported childhood sexual abuse compared to just 14% of men. They were more likely to be victims of family violence and also victims of violence from their relationships or intimate partners. And they had greater rates of sexual abuse. Most of these women also gave up custody of their children prior to being incarcerated, where most of the men didn't need to worry about that because they had the females in their lives who were able to watch the children for them. They didn't need to give up custody of those children. And then after prison, they were more likely to live with family and have financial support. So they were able to really prioritize building relationships with their family and with their children again over the need to gain employment. And they did have much more trouble gaining employment, specifically because of their mental health issues, their physical health issues, which I'll talk about in a minute. They really impacted their ability to maintain and even obtain employment. So some of the themes that permeated through their pre- and post-prison lives, one was being heroin use, which was 2 times as likely among women and was correlated with not only depression, but chronic pain and even the company they kept. So a lot of the women found themselves in sort of circles and networks of individuals and other females who had drug use and abuse because they formed those friendships while they were either in treatment, while they were in shelters, or anything that they did post-prison tended to revolve around other women who had similar life experiences. They tended to have history of, again, childhood sexual abuse and violence, which was then found to be closely related to that heroin use into adulthood as sort of that coping mechanism, that coping dope. And then heroin use was correlated with chronic pain and mental illness in females much more than it was in males. So 40% of women reported back pain compared to 18% of men. 80% reported depression compared to just 32% of men. 27% reported anxiety in prison, while only 13% of men reported anxiety in prison. And then 33%, or 5 times the amount of men, reported PTSD, when only 7% of men reported PTSD symptoms. So these females had much greater combined histories of drug use and mental illness, being 60% when you look at only 29% of the men. So these females really have different pathways. They engage in less violence, so they're more likely to be arrested for drug offenses than they are to be arrested for violent offenses, which the men were, or engaged in a lot more frequently. Men don't have the histories of abuse and mental illness quite the way that women do. So we really find that it's important to treat women a little bit differently and to look at their experiences pre-prison and how we can improve that situation post-prison, knowing what we know about their stories and their histories. So in summary, the pains of incarceration are typically most prominent for women, but some are actually able to use those experiences to form new pro-social identities because they never want to go back there again. Those who identify as a typical former prisoner typically need interventions that are going to focus on their strengths, instilling optimism, hope, and giving them a sense of agency or control over their lives and decisions that they're going to make. And women have much different pathways in and out of the system that's marked by greater rates of childhood sexual abuse and family violence, heroin and other drug use, and physical and mental health problems that men just don't typically see in such great quantities. So that was your chapter 6 or week 6 lecture. I hope everyone has a wonderful week.